Hello, thank you for coming. Welcome to our IHRM webinar. This event is part of a IHRM webinar series organized by Mila Lazarova, Dana Higgins, and Tim Hennessy from the Center for Global Workforce Strategy at Simon Fraser University in Canada, Elaine Farndale and Carolyn Adrian from the Center for International Human Resource Studies, School of Labor and Employment Relations of Penn State University in USA, Maja Vidovic from RIT Croatia in Europe, Miguel Olivas from Clarion University of Pennsylvania, USA, and by Marion Festing and myself, Maral Muratbekova, from ESCP Business School in Europe, so Berlin and Paris campuses. So previous events of the IHRM webinar series are available online at our YouTube channel. You're very welcome to watch them. We will post a link in the chat. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Michael Morley, Professor Michael Morley, who holds the chair in management at the Kemi Business School, University of Limerick in Ireland. His research interests cover international, comparative, and cross-cultural HRM, which he explores at different levels. He has published several books and many journal articles, and his articles have appeared in a very good journal, so I will not read all of them. You will have the full list in his bio in our announcement. So it's like a Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of World Business, Human Relations, Personal Psychology, and so on. Mike is also the current editor-in-chief of European Management Review, the Journal of the European Academy of Management, and he serves also on the editorial boards of several other journals. And he was elected in the past as the chair of the Irish Academy of Management, and he was the president of the International Federation of Scholarly Associations of Management. So, Mike, thank you once more for accepting our invitation. So I'll pass the mic to you. And so Mike's presentation today will deal with the question, how have management and HRM scholars shaped the conversation on the COVID-19 pandemic? Mike, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Maral, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Of necessity, it's of course a virtual welcome. I'm very honoured to have been asked to lead a conversation in the IHRM webinar series. And I wanted at the outset to take a moment to thank the team behind the series, who have worked very hard to keep us all connected since the commencement of the pandemic. And in particular, I want to thank Elaine Farndale, Marion Festing, Mila Lazarova, Maral Muratbekova, Miguel Olivas-Luan, and Maja Vidovic. I also want to thank the technical people behind the scenes, who sometimes, I think, whose work goes unnoticed, Carrie Adrienne in Penn State, Dana Higgins, and Tim Hennessy in Simon Fraser University. As at least a handful of you will know, the IHRM webinar series and its forerunner, the IHRM conference, has a particular resonance for me. I had the pleasure of hosting the conference here at the University of Limerick in the days when we could all meet in person. That was back in 2003. I have no idea where that time has gone in between, but I do remember that it was a highly formative and a developmental experience for me as a younger scholar. And many of the delegates who attended IHRM 2003 went on to become good friends and collaborators of mine in the academic journey that I've been on. And speaking of collaborations, today's effort is also based on an emerging collaboration. And there are two wonderful young scholars that I want to acknowledge at the very outset. The first is Dr. Njal Andersson, who's at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Ålesund in Norway. And the second is Dr. Keila Diane da Silva Oliveira from the Universidade Municipal de São Caetano do Sul in Brazil. And both of these colleagues have been an enormous help to me in beginning to position our arguments and get my head around the corpus of work that we've been looking at. My talk today is of necessity a talk in two halves. It has a retrospective element in which we look back. And I think it was Winston Churchill who once said that the longer you look back, the further you can, of course, look forward. My talk also has a prospective element, speculating about the likely shape of things going forward and how we can deploy our toolkit as organizational and management scholars to capture and to document this, and also increasingly, of course, to shape it. It should also be said that it's very much an unfinished story. The story of the pandemic itself is ongoing, and the scholarship that people are producing is growing exponentially. We're therefore only able to capture a particular slice of that scholarship at the moment. But it's also clear that we're at an important moment, and it provides a unique empirical context. Characterized variously as an extreme event, an exogenous shock, a black swan event, it creates what Heather McGowan, writing in Forbes magazine, characterizes as an inflection point in the future of work. Specifically here in the Irish context, Valerie Daunt from Deloitte, in the most recent Global Capital Trends report, suggests that one of the few positive things that has emerged from the pandemic has been a glimpse into what people are capable of when traditional constraints such as hierarchies and bureaucracy and 9-to-5s are stripped away. And in her report, several workplace trends are identified. Importantly, designing work for well-being, and in particular focusing on building a sustainable future where workers can feel and perform at their best, emerges as critical. In addition, she points to the importance of integrating humans and technology so that their complementary capabilities can be used to what she describes as re-architecting work in new and more humane ways. From a HR perspective, the suggestion is that the future of work was always going to need the HR function to expand its remit. But the pandemic has accelerated this process by opening up a new window of opportunity for the function to reimagine work, to reimagine working lives, and to reimagine aspects of how the collective effort can be delivered going forward. It was against this backdrop that I became interested in how business and HR scholars are focusing on the pandemic. And in my editorial role, as Maral mentioned, in European Management Review, for the past year, I had attended several Meet the Editor sessions. And at most of those sessions, one of the things that we repeatedly heard was the so-called COVID bounce in scholarship. And this seemed to refer to a significant rise in the number of submissions that journals were receiving. And many of those, of course, were focused on aspects of the pandemic. And this seemed like an opportunity to look at the nature of the work, where we had put our energies, and indeed to what effect. It also seemed like an opportunity for me to engage with the issue of the critical charges that are commonly leveled at management scholarship, against which the backdrop of this unfolding crisis could also present an interesting opportunity. And many of these questions you will all be familiar with because they are well rehearsed in the literature. It seems questions relating to the relevance of our scholarship remain important. Questions relating to the enduring academic practice divide, these remain ongoing. And also questions around universalism versus particularism and the extent to which our work has given fuller expression to context as part of a diversity of research initiatives. And so in this unfolding event, this universal event that we've all been working to try and understand, a quick stock-taking exercise of where scholars have focused their energies and what they have unearthed seemed to me to be an appropriate point of departure. Before I go there, I should also mention a couple of important caveats. As I wrote in a piece with my colleagues Ronan Carberry and Paddy Gunnigal in the Irish Journal of Management some time ago, retrospectives are not entirely straightforward exercises. Firstly, determining what precisely the field is and what its likely boundaries are is a challenge, and it's one which will, at minimum, engender debate. Secondly, having settled on some parameters, what constitutes works in the field and why some might fail to be part of the review process, fail to be included, that's always also, of course, a critical concern. Thirdly, ascribing some importance to some work over other, even where that ascription is based on broadly agreed objective indicators, that too may often be a matter of perspective. And moreover, of course, phenomena of this nature have to be understood and spotlighted and examined against the backdrop of the prevailing circumstances that apply at the particular point in time. Now, those caveats introduced, it's also, I think, fair to say that retrospectives are important. They are important because they cast light on the nature, the contours of the scholarship that's being produced. They also demonstrate important things about a field, the provenance of the field, its developmental trajectory, its eventual spread, the changing priorities of the field, the boundaries, the labels, the evolving contextual circumstances, and overall, of course, the impact of the scholarship in the field itself. So on the whole, one of the ways I try to think about it is retrospective analyses are important for what I describe as enhancing the particular systematics in a field. So it was against this backdrop that we chose a particular question to look at a corpus of scholarship produced by business and management scholars around the pandemic. And the question we chose was, how have management and HR scholars shaped the conversation on the pandemic? And that seemed like an appropriate question in the context of looking retrospectively at the body of work. So how then did we address the question? Well, in order to address it, we adopted the following procedure. Firstly, we used Web of Science publications, and we focused on publications that are on the academic journal guide listed as 3s, 4s, and 4 stars. And we chose the following categories within the academic guide: ethics, corporate social responsibility and management, which has 21 scholarly outlets in the guide. We looked at work and organizational psychology and behavior outlets, of which there are 22. We looked at innovation scholarship. Here there are 7 scholarly outlets. In human resource management and employment relations, there are 14. In international business and area studies, there are 9. In marketing, there are 20. In entrepreneurship and small business, there are 9. In organization studies, we have 11 outlets. And finally, in strategy, we have 4. And we chose the following string: COVID, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus, and that string represented our point of departure for searching the corpus of work itself. Subsequent to that, we did different kinds of analyses. We engaged particular analyses around bibliometric and subsequently on the textual side. So from the bibliometric analysis, which involves the application of quantitative techniques on bibliometric data, we used the keywords supplied by the authors, and also we used the keywords plus field, which is a series of expanded terms that stem from the records cited as references in the scholarship itself. And both of these were then subjected to a co-occurrence analysis, and we visualized that in VOS Viewer. On the textual side, the keywords and the abstracts were subjected to similarity analysis. And this studies the proximity and relations between elements of a set of words. And we also used hierarchical descending classification, which checks the text segments and then classifies them. And we did this using the Ramitex software. And the idea, the purpose of all of this was to use that evidence as a point of departure for thinking about the future and for calling attention to additional ideas in our toolkit that we might usefully use as we continue to try to both understand and to navigate the pandemic. So you see here the number of studies in each of the domain areas since the start of the pandemic. There are 215 studies in the ethics, CSR, and management cohort. There are 114 in IO psychology and organizational behavior, 65 in innovation, 38 in marketing, 29 in international business, 25 in HR and employment relations, 25 in entrepreneurship, and subsequently in organization studies and in strategy, there are 7 and 3 studies respectively. So in total, based on this procedure, there were 521 publications in levels 3, 4, and 4-star from the Journal Academic Guide. And this was of the 1st of October when we finished our original corpus gathering. And of these, there were 2 corrections, 74 editorials, 7 letters, 438 articles and review studies. 23 of these did not include abstracts and therefore, of course, could not be included in the text analysis. And 21 didn't include keywords and therefore, again, could not be included in the subsequent keyword analysis that we performed. Let's turn then to how we visualize this body of work. And based on the co-occurrence analysis that we did, we could identify 10 major themes, which we label as follows: gender and work, well-being and work, occupational health, health and technology, technology adoption, individual resilience, organizational resilience, innovation and capability, managing in crisis, and leadership challenges. And we take a moment to look into each of these. And what you see are a series of salient and linked topics within each domain area. So in gender and work, one of the things that comes through is the unequal burden that women have experienced, surfacing issues around identity, inequality, family responsibilities, and issues regarding how and whether organizations fully appreciate this. In the well-being and work category, this was a stream that focuses on experiences, for example, relating to anxiety, to stress, to burnout, to engagement, and importantly, the role of HR in safeguarding employee well-being. Looking at the occupational health stream, I was particularly reminded of the ideas actually that Helen Desiri had showcased in her keynote at the HR Division Conference organised by Brian Harney and Dave Collings in Dublin. And little could Helen have envisaged the prescience and the centrality of the issues that she was raising from her research on health and safety, and how they would become front and centre during the pandemic. And so here, in this part of the corpus, issues relating to health and safety practice, to occupational hygiene, to hazards and disease transmission are at the centre of the scholarship. There are 2 streams of work focused on technology. Firstly, the issue of technology and health. And this seems to relate to what I refer to as technological creep, exacerbated of necessity by the pandemic and its consequences, in particular for the work-life interface. And secondly, there's a cohort of work on technological adoption, where issues such as the deployment of appropriate systems and tools and their acceptance by users is especially covered. In the case of resilience, it occupies a key place in the scholarship. Firstly, there's a series of scholarship dealing with individual resilience. And here, personality, creativity, self-regulation, all of these things are in the face of what is referred to in the literature as the salience of mortality. In the context of organizational resilience, unsurprisingly, it's also well rehearsed in this literature, and in particular, issues around supply chain disruption, globalization, knowledge flows, governance, and CSR seem to be at the forefront. From an organizational perspective, innovation and capability have also featured. And here, the search for dynamic capabilities and the criticality of effective decision-making in the face of significant risk factors and uncertainty are all discussed. And the last two themes relate to managing in crisis and leadership challenges. And they focus a series of both operational and strategic issues of relevance to the immediate circumstances firms were facing in the moment of the crisis, and how they might also build for the future. So here, for example, we see work on teleworking, we see work on remote working, and how organizations might provide for meeting social distance requirements, but also how to maintain community. And in the context of leadership challenges, organizational scholarship seems to have focused on policy interventions, the criticality of networks, and social supports, and how individuals can maintain careers in the context of the pandemic. Turning then to the textual side of our work, we engaged in what's referred to as a similarity analysis. And as I mentioned earlier, to run the similarity analysis, we used the title, keywords, and the text of the abstracts in order to represent the connection between words in the analyzed textual corpus. The results of the similarity analysis are shown in a tree graph in which the leaves hanging from the same branch form groups of words. And these refer to the closest words in the corpus itself. So here's a look, a map if you like, of the full corpus, in which you can visualize some of the themes just mentioned in the co-occurrence analysis. So unsurprisingly, various combinations and permutations of work, of health, of crisis, of gender, and the range of different organizational, sectoral, national, and international context in which these salient topics are being researched all feature as part of the body of the work. Just to illustrate for you some of the genesis of the work and what lies beneath it, so to speak, and also given that the number of contributions in both ethics, CSR, and management, and in IO psychology were larger domains, we coded these works separately, and we ran two independent similarity analyses. And so here, in this map, you see the landscape of the work in ethics, CSR, and management. And the various works grouped relate to the crisis, the impact of alternative work arrangements on family and home, the impact of mental health and streams of work, for example, dealing with gender, motherhood, care, and homeschooling. And just to give you one other example, relating specifically to the work in the corpus categorized in the IO psychology and the OB space, we see a somewhat similar pattern. It's around altered work, workplace and work context circumstances, and importantly, some of the spillover effects, along also, of course, with streams of work dealing with health and critically important health-related topics. The final part of our analysis for this presentation related to the conducting of a so-called descending hierarchical classification on the entire corpus. Again, as an approach, this facilitates the classifying of the articles into thematic groups, and it enables a fuller understanding of the relationships between them based on elements of their content. The method systematizes the analysis of different texts in a dendrogram. And in taking this kind of approach to analysis, we have identified three major classes of work that we can usefully distinguish and speak about. The first class we label as organizational responses. This cohort of work, which is largely, though not exclusively, it has to be said, an organizational lens, is focused on the impact of the crisis from various economic, management, and stakeholder perspectives. Importantly, it's also focused on trying to find ways out of the crisis so that organizations might find for themselves a secure and a sustainable path to the future. Class 2, we labeled as occupational health and well-being. And as you will see, this is largely focused on individuals, on their experiences, and on the sequence of surrounding health challenges that have been part of all of the pandemic. So here we see work documenting the anxiety that people have experienced, the exhaustion, the burnout, the fatigue, and the impacts that these things are having. These are all rehearsed in that second class of scholarship. And the third category we label as gender, work, and opportunity. And as I've mentioned earlier in the cohort work, this specifically taps into the burden that the pandemic has been having on people, and importantly, how this seems to have been experienced rather unequally. Within this class, we see work focused on inequality, on the sharing of responsibilities around parenting, on care work, on housework, in addition to expressed vulnerabilities and concerns about becoming professionally less visible in the organizations that many people belonged to. So that's a landscape, that's a set of contours of the body of work that we've been looking at. And I wanted to use that to provide a springboard for talking about the future. So how is, against the backdrop of what we know and what we've established, how is the future to be handled? There's little doubt that considering the shape of the organization post-pandemic, leaders, and indeed all of us, are going to be challenged to reconsider the social and the technical constructs intertwined with work, with employment, and, as we have come to understand, with society. I think a first issue here is, what is our mindset as chroniclers and documenters of organizational life, of work, of the workplace, and work life? Are we of the view that what's simply required is a recalibration? Or are we more persuaded by the importance of more radical reinvention? And it's in this context that I wanted to suggest some ideas in our toolkit as organizational scholars that I think can help us to understand the phenomenon more, and also that I believe we need to focus more on topics for particular consideration given the evolving nature of work. I wanted to start at the systems level. And I have two particular ideas around a systems perspective: systems theory and or event systems theory and ecosystem theory. In future modeling the impact of the pandemic, I think we might usefully draw some ideas from event system theory as postulated by Morgeson et al. In 2015. and it focuses on how events have an impact on organizations. One of the prototypical effects of events on entities refers to a top-down direct effect, whereby the environmental systems eventually, subsequently impact entities operating within that system. In other words, major environmental events can produce change in heretofore stable organizational level behavior. Hila Peretz and I have taken some inspiration from this in looking at and modeling the impact of deglobalization on MNCs. And I can see some strong parallels with the pandemic as a dramatic systems event shift. I also wanted to mention ecosystems thinking. I think we might more strongly focus on the ecosystem of work and organizing. And here, I wanted to augment something that Vlad Vyman dealt with in detail in his webinar on fluid workers, and around the idea of the ecosystem of work. And in particular, I wanted to mention work also that my colleague Katrina Burke and I have been doing around this process of understanding the broader ecosystem. The term ecosystem occurs 13 times more frequently in annual reports in 2020 than it did a decade ago. And it refers to a whole lot of different aspects of work and organizing. Despite this semantic overstretch, as we refer to it, at the heart of ecosystem thinking lies a substantive phenomenon and a significant departure from traditional conceptions of work, namely organizational and non-organizational actors working and co-evolving in temporary clusters of semi-fluid relationships which span traditional boundaries. Now, a recent MIT Sloan Management Review report on workforce ecosystems by Elizabeth Altman and colleagues is based on a survey of 5,000 professionals and 27 executive interviews. And in that report, they note that when managers are asked today how they define their workforce, a common answer is, that's a very good question. It's a good question, they say, because they feel often squeezed between two realities. One reality is that their workforce increasingly depends on external workers, as Vlad had called attention to. The other reality is that their management practices, systems, and processes are designed for internal employees. The struggle to reconcile these two realities is an ongoing challenge, with significant implications for strategy, for leadership, for organizational culture, for workforce management practices more broadly. Workforce planning, talent acquisition, performance management, and compensation systems, for example, all tend to focus on full-time and to a lesser extent, part-time employees. Managing employees and managing a workforce ecosystem structure are likely to be very different processes into the future. At the organizational level, I wanted to mention two particular ideas. And they're linked in some ways with the ecosystem's ideas. I think we need to focus more of our efforts on understanding temporary organizations. The Project Management Institute has recently estimated the total GDP of projectified industries globally will likely increase from $24 trillion in 2019 to $34.5 trillion by 2030. And again, my colleague Katrina Burke and I define these temporary organizations as temporally bounded collectives of interdependent actors in pursuit of some mandate or mandates embedded within multiple contexts simultaneously, which set the boundaries and constrain the entity. They have become a dominant form of organizing across a range of industries, including construction, media and entertainment, and the software industry, to name but a few. They typically operate under conditions of institutional complexity and of pluralism. And perhaps the single most important distinguishing feature from an organization perspective is their so-called deliberate institutionalized termination. The entity is determined to be a success when it dies. Success is signaled not by longevity and continuity, but ultimately by death. HRM scholarship on the temporary organization and the inherent complexity that accompany it is significantly underdeveloped. Dana Menbeba, in her HRM review article in 2020, speaks directly to HRM scholars, and she poses the question, what theoretical assumptions do we in the HRM field need to change or challenge when organizational permanence no longer holds? I think we can also more fully curate and incorporate ideas from high reliability organizing. Initiated by an interdisciplinary research group at the University of California, Berkeley in the 1980s, the subsequent work by Weik and colleagues introduced the central notion of collective mindfulness. These colleagues extracted 5 key processes through which organizations maintain their reliable operations under unexpected or trying and difficult conditions, and manage in so doing to produce a state of mindfulness. The first 3 of these are known as the principles of anticipation, and they comprise a preoccupation with failure, a reluctance to simplify, and a sensitivity to operations. And whilst the remaining 2 are called the principles of containment, a commitment to resilience, and a deference to expertise. And I think high reliability ideas will be more important going forward in light of the centrality of resilience as a capability that has allowed organizations, at least some of them, to navigate the pandemic more successfully than others. So too do I think that long-established socio-technical systems thinking has much to offer in light of the pandemic, especially at the team and the unit level. The pandemic has placed a renewed focus on the debate about organizations as both technical and, importantly, as social systems, and how to maintain the important elements of the social side of organization in the face of enforced distance, hybridity, etc. It has also elevated the place of the formal organization, and to a certain extent has relegated the place of the informal. All of us have experienced the rise in formal aspects of how we work and have significantly fewer opportunities to tap into the informal side of work and to getting things done in this way. I think ensuring a balance here is going to be hugely important going forward. And in the relentless rise of technology, the maintenance of a strong emphasis on the social side of organization is going to be hugely important. I wanted to also mention insights which have been established from communities of practice. And I think these may be important, in particular around the importance of tacit knowledge and how to tap into it in order to respond to unexpected events. It's exactly 30 years since the publication of the first major scholarly article on communities of practice by Brown and Duguid, in which they essentially focus on a perspective on organizational learning. And they proposed that communities of practice play a central role in developing an organization's ability to work, to learn, and of course, to innovate. And scholars have proposed 3 key structural elements to a community of practice. Firstly, mutual engagement, how and what people do together in the conduct of their work. Secondly, joint enterprise, focusing on a discrete set of problems or challenges that they are particularly concerned about. And thirdly, a so-called shared repertoire. This relates to the constructs, to the ideas, and the understandings that this community create. And in the present context in which many of us operate, there's a danger that a dominant focus on the tools to enable learning and knowledge sharing, which are useful, but which will not provide opportunities for mutual engagement, which can only occur when individuals have both the time to think together and the time to collaborate. So an important question that arises is, how do we extend communities of practice which have served many organizations well beyond the conventional organizational setting? This is something that once again is likely to emerge as an important question going forward. Finally, when I reflect on the corpus of work that we've been looking at to date, most especially the body of work on gender and the unequal way in which the pandemic has been experienced, there seems to me to be an emerging paradox that the flexibilities, especially employee-driven flexibilities, that we have long sought and long researched, they're also now giving rise to additional, and in many instances, unintended consequences. And one of the ways in which we can more fully articulate that is around, I think, the notion of intersectionality, especially at the individual level. Intersectionality argues that people are characterized simultaneously by their membership in multiple social categories, and by awareness that these categories are intertwined such that the experience of one social category is linked to their membership of other social categories. And as ACRE 2009 demonstrates, intersectionality in work and organizations started with a focus on social identities and moved toward what's referred to as structural manifestations of workplace inequalities, such as the attention to gendered organizations and to inequality regimes played out within organizations. I think intersectionality offers an opportunity to nuance our understanding of work and workplaces and how people experience those workplaces. It may serve as a tipping point for building insights on ways in which individuals are both empowered but also constrained. Certain individuals are empowered but also constrained relative to others. It offers the potential of revealing the role of context, untangling the complexity of human behaviors, and the range of work, workplace, and work-life experiences during the pandemic and in likely future evolving scenarios. So as an afterword, I wanted to pick up on the theme of interdisciplinarity. This is something which has been identified by several of the previous speakers at the IHRM webinar series, including most recently Fang-Lee Cook, and of course earlier by Anvil Hartzing. And in thinking about that interdisciplinarity, my view is that we need to raise our sights as a scholarly community. We need to build bridges. We need to broaden our lines of inquiry. We need to adopt a more interdisciplinary approach. And we need to apply our research tools in further addressing the pressing challenges arising from this very significant systems event shift. We have a rare opportunity to create a legacy that defines the future of organizing, defines the future of work, and defines many of the features of the future of working life. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mike. It was very interesting, inspiring. So for the questions, by the way, don't hesitate to use the question and answers function as Caroline was writing to you, and put your questions there and write down your questions there. So the first question that I would like to ask you is, what do you see as the advantage of this kind of mapping approach?
Yeah, so it's a very important question, Maral, actually, and increasingly, of course, we see much more of this kind of work going on, and I think it certainly has its place in the sense that it helps us to, as I would describe it, understand the topography or the landscape of a body of work. And so as we see a significant rise in scholarship, and as we see, the so-called COVID bounce in particular is something I mentioned in my talk, analysis governed by this kind of retrospective bibliometric type work can be useful for landscaping. It provides mechanisms by which you can spotlight certain things. There is a degree of objectivity, there is a degree of reliability and validity in the effort. There's also, of course, a degree of subjectivity, as I mentioned at the outset, depending upon the choices that we make about where to make cutoffs about what gets in and what doesn't and so on. But I think as an exercise, it provides a starting point. It provides an opportunity for spotlighting certain things that have been strongly focused on, but also for perhaps spotlighting particular themes or topics that somehow have scarce less mention. And it does so in a way in which we can then identify particular research opportunities in order to build a bridge to the future. So I think it's important. It's especially important given that it's increasingly possible technically, but its importance, of course, is no substitute for us delving into and reading and understanding in a systematic way the body of knowledge that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you, Mike. There is a question from Stefan Jaws, who thanks you, of course, for the presentations. We have many thanks for your interesting and provoking talk. So Stefan is asking, saying that how do you respond to reviews who state that we cannot draw implications about post-pandemic contexts with the pandemic still ongoing? So in other words, how we can publish something on implications now based on pre- and mid-pandemic empirical data, but without having longitudinal post-pandemic data?
Yeah, this is a hugely important question. And, one of the caveats, Maral, I introduced at the very outset is that this is an evolving story. And the story that I tell today is very much a preliminary and evolving story in the context of all that is happening and the speed at which it's happening and so on. It raises important questions around temporality in our research. A small number of you may know, early in my career, I spent quite a bit of time working with colleagues in Central and Eastern Europe, looking at the transition economies and all of the things that were happening in those economies as they moved into major transition post the collapse of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And one of the things I remarked at the time was this hugely important drive for so-called transformational type approaches. And I was never persuaded by it at the time. I was much more persuaded by this idea of transition and gradual incrementalism. And even 25 years after the transition, people would say, what do we understand about Central and Eastern European transition now? And there are those who would argue and say, it's actually too early to say. And I mention that in the context of the pandemic, and because it seems to me it's going to take us a tremendous amount of time to really begin to come to terms with the scale of the systems event shift that has come about and how that shift has affected all manner of our lives, both personally and professionally, but especially for this talk, of course, our work and working lives. And so I think we can really only speculate about the future right now. I think none of us really know more than that. But I think what we can do is perhaps delve into the toolkit that we have with a view to saying whether we have deployed this or this idea as one that can help us build ideas about where the future might unfold. But directly to Stefan's point, it's really, I would say, for a temporal question, and of course it is too early to say. I think retrospectives of this kind are valuable for spotlighting things about future research agendas, and those future research agendas are likely to continue to play themselves out rather differently, depending on how the pandemic shapes up. We know that this global event has been experienced very unequally, not just by individuals, as I've highlighted from the scholarship that we've looked at, but it's been experienced unequally by organizations, by sectors, by governments, by societies, and so on. And so one of the positive things about that is that it will require us to be better contextualists. This universal event has resulted in dramatically contextual different impacts depending upon how it is you cut it. And I think that's a story that's going to be continue to evolve for some time to come. So there's no silver bullet, I think, to addressing reviewers' comments about here's where we're likely to head. I think of necessity, Stefan, we're going to probably have to remain somewhat speculative. And I think, as I mentioned, I think it raises temporal issues around how we conduct research, when we conduct research, and how it is we try to build in temporal elements to it.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And actually, you are prepared the next questions. Not you are not, but I mean, I'm looking at the questions. And Igor Gurkov, for example, asks why there are there are not so many studies on strategy. Almina, I'm combining several questions. And Almina Besic, if I pronounce correctly, asking is that contextualization, as you said, is very, very important. And was the focus on certain regions, developed versus developing, on what was the focus, maybe some special regions, context, what do we miss?
Yes.
Is it more empirical, theoretical, especially taking into account that we are not still on post-pandemic version? So can you just develop more on the context of what was happening?
Yeah, so the short answer, Maral, in some ways would be that it's actually, it's all of those things. And I don't mean that to sound inappropriate in any way, but so there are a few strategy studies that fell out of the cut that we made in the context of the body of work. Directly addressing Igor's question, I'm not quite sure why that is, but I'm certain that strategy scholarship, particularly around multinationals, is on the rise through the pandemic lens. So I think there's much more of that probably happening and likely to fill the pages of our journals going forward. And in relation to Almina's question, it's a very important one actually, because there is certainly evidence of both a range of scholarship in terms of theoretical and empirical, much like the relatively fast pace at which many of the inoculations and drugs and so on have been, teams have tried to develop to curb the pandemic. In as much as they've happened fast, a lot of research has also happened fast. So there is quite a deal of empirical work which has gone on, and it has happened in relatively fast time period. But there's also a degree of theorizing. There's a lot of speculative research around editorial, speculative research around ideas about both the impact of the pandemic and also its likely future. But I do think the contextualization issue that I mentioned, I think that's going to grow in importance, most especially given what I've said about how the pandemic has been experienced very unequally. And in being experienced so unequally, there are, of course, universal threads that we can draw together. But I think there are also very unique contextual stories at the individual, the organizational, the community level, and so on that need to be told. And I do imagine that over time, they will be an important part of the evolving corpus of work that is going to grow inexorably.
Yeah, thank you. Fernando Miyazaki, your former student apparently from your Brazilian college, Wilson Amorim, he asks, actually you responded, but maybe you can focus on this. In your opinion, the way individuals, companies, and scholars approach the pandemic will it soften or sharpen regional differences in terms of HRM practices?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and the honest answer, Wilson, Fernando, is I don't know. I think one of the things that surprised me, and perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, but one of the things that surprised me was how reflective of the inequality the body of work already is. I mean, at a kind of a geopolitical level, we could see that as part of the discourse. And if you follow anything in political science, you could see how that inequality was clearly shaping up as part of a global conversation. But within the body of organizational scholarship, it also emerged as a very significant part of what it is we've been looking at. The extent to which that might result in some kind of equalization or some kind of more focused thinking about some principles into the future, the honest answer, Wilson, is I don't know. But I do think there will be an increasing focus, I think, on stakeholders. Several colleagues have already raised this issue, including in writing about HR, that we've had long a focus on HR and strategy and strategic aspects, and that's important, of course it is. But I think aspects of organizational life around stakeholder thinking are also growing in importance now. And it seems to me that much of that stakeholder thinking could form part of the conversation that's going to unfold into the future.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And I'm sorry I have to stop with the questions because we're running out of time. We have to shut down this webinar in 1 minute. Just to conclude, I would like to repeat again that this talk is a part of a series. And the next one is scheduled on December 1st with Emma Parry as a leading guest speaker, because she's going to invite other scholars to speak about developing IHRM insight using effective cross-national research. And it will be as interesting as all other topics, so please come. And once more, I would like to say a big thank you, Mike, very much again. Thank you very much also to all colleagues who are involved in organizing this webinar, and of course to all the participants. Thank you for coming, and we hope you found it interesting and useful, and hope to see you in December. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Maral. Thanks so much, colleagues.